This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to another episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. I'm Sam Camp, and I'm your host, joined by Richard Blackaby. Richard,
good to be with you again, Sam.
It's good to be with you as well, and it's good to have all of our listeners with us, as always. Today, we're starting a new series, which is always exciting. New things are always good. It's, new year.
Behold, I will do a new thing, says the Lord.
Exactly. New things are great, and it's always exciting. I love new things, probably too much, because I'll forget to finish perhaps the old thing or whatever it was, the last new thing that I started. But for this podcast, we're doing something new, and as you would guess, it has to do with leaders. Yeah. And specifically, we're calling it Leaders in the Bible. And so what we'd like to do is take a look at some of the leaders that have been mentioned in the Bible. Some obvious ones come to mind, but we're going to go through and just look at their leadership. We often look at, I think, biblical characters in more of a perhaps devotional way. That, hey, what about their life and their perhaps relationship to God or Christ can we glean from that? But I think a lot of times we forget that these were people who were leading other people. And I think sometimes that can be lost. And Richard, you've done some work in this area already. I know you talk about Moses in your book, Living Out of the Overflow. Mm-hmm. And so as it happens, we're going to be talking about Moses today. Yeah. And so maybe just out of the gate, why Moses? What about his life, about his leadership merits a podcast? And maybe that's obvious, but why don't you tell us why you've picked Moses to start this new series?
Yeah, Sam, as you said, the book, or the Bible, is filled with great lessons on leadership. It's about influence. It's about changing the world. And thousands of years after the Bible was written, we're still being impacted by their lives. So they've obviously had lasting influence. And Moses is certainly one of those in some ways, certainly in the Old Testament, perhaps the greatest leader of the Old Testament. And in fact, the first 5 books of the Bible are known as the Law, the Pentateuch, and at times it's just known as the books of Moses. Moses is traditionally seen as the author of those books, which was the foundation of the Jewish religion, the law, which the Pharisees would become great experts in. But Moses is the towering figure of the Old Testament.
For sure.
Much like Elijah will become the towering figure of the prophets, and you could say David, a towering figure of the Psalms. And so those 3 characters together cover they dominate, you might say, a great part of the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, the literature, or the wisdom literature. And so I thought we'd just start with Moses because he's such a foundational person.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So maybe what are some things, let's start with, we've done leader profiles in the past, and it's a favorite, I think, segment on this podcast. But maybe let's look at some of his accomplishments and then also what he had to overcome in order to be the leader that God called him to be.
Well, certainly Moses is known as the deliverer of the Israelites out of Egypt.
No small feat.
No. Yeah. We're not sure necessarily how many years they were in bondage, but they were in Egypt altogether, the Bible says, about 430 years. And so assuming that at least half that time or more was spent in bondage, then you're trying to deliver people who've been slaves for a couple of centuries. Yeah. And you got to think in a couple of centuries, these people have longed for freedom. They've dreamed of ways to escape, but nothing has ever worked. And then one day Moses shows up and says, I have a word from God, and God wants to take you out. And he takes people that have been slaves for generations. They have a slave mentality. They're not strong leaders, most of them. They live in fear. They've been intimidated all their lives. And so to orchestrate them in a way that they can trust God in a wilderness, facing down the world's most powerful army, is no small feat. And So he delivers them and basically founds the nation of Israel. And not only does he if he had just done that, that would have been significant. But perhaps his more lasting contribution is that he writes the law. He goes and gets the Ten Commandments and all of the foundational laws that the Jewish people, even to this day, to some extent, still follow. Certainly the Orthodox Jews do. Is a tribute to his lasting influence because he wrote the law. And I always say, if you want to have a lasting influence, put your thoughts down on paper.
Yeah.
And by writing 5 books of the law, even thousands of years later, people are still being impacted by Moses' thought. He was trained in the schools of Egypt, and so you could say he had a law degree, the best education available in the world at the time. And I think it's not surprising that the person who writes the primary law of the Old Testament is a very well-educated person. And certainly the person who delineates a lot of the law in the New Testament, or the gospel and that teaching is Paul, who also is highly educated. And many have said that perhaps the most exalted book of the prophets is Isaiah. And Isaiah, again, would have been a very educated person in the king's court. And so Moses, establishing the law, is a writer, a thinker, but also a man of action. And so you put all that together, and as a thinker, and he doesn't just deliver the Israelites, he establishes the culture of the Israelites, a lifestyle, standards of this is how we will be as a people. And so he leaves his mark, even that is still being felt even to this day.
Well, and when you think of Moses, he is that sort of singular character in Scripture. And but even Moses, I think it's interesting, had his number 2, Aaron. And, I think we often attribute that sort of singular genius, if you will, of leadership. And Moses certainly, I think you could fall into that trap of thinking that he just did it all himself. Obviously, he was called from God, but even with Moses, he had good people around him as well that allowed him to be a leader. So maybe tell us what, likely we know some of the things that he had to overcome, but maybe
quite famous.
Run down the highlights for us.
Well, for one, I think we forget sometimes that he is actually at least the third child, maybe the baby of the family. He's got an older brother, Aaron, and he's got an older sister, Miriam. And so he's got 2 older siblings, and that's just not done that a younger sibling leads the older siblings. Yeah. And of course that would cause him some conflict. At one point Miriam gets a little disrespectful of him as the older sister. It's you wonder sometimes when Moses said, I can't speak, was he used to Aaron always doing the talking of the 2 of them? Is that why God says, okay, I'll get your older brother? You're used to letting him do the talking anyway. And so, of course, in the Bible, even though that's expected that the firstborn son will lead the family, oftentimes that's not the case. People like David has got lots of older brothers. Jacob ends up leading over his twin brother Esau, who's technically older than he is. So God doesn't necessarily follow that rule, but society typically does. And so for Moses, you can kind of understand maybe a little bit about why is he so reluctant to lead? Well, he's the baby of his family. He may not have led anything growing up in one sense. He was raised in the king's court and Pharaoh's court, so he is well educated and he's groomed to be a prince. Right. But maybe birth order has something to do with it. And then, of course, he almost dies. He's almost put to death as a baby. Pharaoh puts out the word to kill all the babies. We got too many male babies being born, and we're getting overrun. And of course, he's miraculously saved. And I've often thought about that. As a historian, you look back over a person's life, and lots of people could look back and say, I was actually quite ill there, or my mother almost died at this point, or my dad served in the army and was almost killed before I was born. And it's not hard to look back sometimes and realize, had it not been for God's providential care over your ancestors or over your own life as a child, the fact that you're alive today to serve God is something of a miracle in itself. And I think Moses certainly is one of those you could look back and say, well, God must have obviously God had a purpose for him because God spared his life. And I think sometimes even for us, we need to stop and look at our life and say, if God has preserved me through that almost fatal car accident I was in as a teenager and that illness that put me in the hospital, and well, maybe that's because God has a purpose for my life, and there's something God is keeping me around for that I need to accomplish. And then, of course, he experiences an early failure in his life,
which could be attributed to some of his reluctance to lead anything later.
Yeah, he's probably told God has a purpose for your life. One day God may use you to deliver your people. And so he's grown up with those thoughts dancing around in his head. And so as he famously does when he's about 40 years old, he goes out to see his people. And you can imagine he's grown up in the king's palace. He's grown up with riches and comfort and all kinds of opulence. And so but he decides to go. Something draws him. Let's go look at my slave relatives and see how they're doing. And
which that's got, just psychologically, that's got to be very disorienting for him.
Yeah. You wonder what kind of guilt he might have felt.
Yeah.
Because his own sister and brother and parents are living as slaves, being whipped by Egyptian taskmasters, while he is being fanned by slaves and all the comforts of Pharaoh's palace.
Well, and you wonder too, just the people's attitude towards him as well.
Yeah.
When he does start to think of himself as a leader.
Yeah, and I imagine if I were a Hebrew that's been working on the pyramid all my life, and here comes one of my relatives who's been living in the king's palace, but he identifies as one of us, but he's, he has no calluses on his hands, no lash marks on his back. Hey, but you're my people. It's like,
not likely.
Yeah. So, and who knows? I mean, maybe part of his job was overseeing the army, or maybe he was looked as just part of, management that has created all this grief. But he sees a couple of his people being mistreated, and famously, as we know the story, he looks this way and looks that way, and then kills the Egyptian and tries to bury the evidence. And of course, ironically, people have said that when Moses tried to deliver the Israelites his way, he was unable even to bury one Egyptian. When he does things God's way, God buries an entire Egyptian army.
Yeah.
And to say there's a huge difference between doing things your way and doing it God's way. He can't even hide one Egyptian body, and it gets back to the Pharaoh, and Moses has to run for his life. So Moses is a murderer. He's failed. He now, instead of having the favor of the Pharaoh, he's wanted. He's a wanted man by the Pharaoh. He can't show his face back in Egypt. He's got nothing. He can't really identify with his own people because he's never lived as a slave with them. He can't identify with the Egyptian people anymore. So it's almost as if his life has just come to an end, and he ends up out in a wilderness. And for 40 years, the only job he can get is working for his father-in-law and herding sheep. This guy's trained to be a prince, and instead of all this great training and everything else, he's herding sheep for 40 years, oftentimes probably just by himself with nothing but these animals. And you do it for 40 years. I mean, that'd be fine as a respite or a landing site till he moves on to something else. But after 40 years of just working with dumb animals, you sort of figure that's it, like there's nothing more. He's a failure. He's a murderer. He's a fugitive. He probably works alone most of the time, so he doesn't even relate to other people. It doesn't. If his father-in-law, if it's his flocks, he may not even be selling them or working all those kind of details out. He just is out there with him and the sheep. And so you just think after 40 years, there's no future. There's no hope. Any chances I did have in my life, I've blown them. I missed my opportunity. So, he, at that point, from his early failure, would conclude, I missed my chance. And the interesting thing is when you look at, as we've looked at a number of just biographies from history, they all have early failures. It seems as if every one of them makes mistakes, has regrets, does some foolish things in their youth. It almost seems to be a prerequisite for being a great leader later and of course it's how you process your failures that really matters, or how you let God process them. And so he certainly had his failures as well. The last thing maybe just to say about Moses and the upbringing is he also had his areas of weakness, and as again all leaders do, and probably two that were particular to him. One was he had an anger issue. There's several times in the Bible where Moses will lose it, and when you see the kind of grumbling, complaining, criticizing people that he had to work with all the time, it's not necessarily surprising.
It's not hard to blame him.
But for instance, when he's coming down with the Ten Commandments and he sees the people all worshiping Baal and so on, the golden calf, he throws the tablets to the ground, breaks them. We'll have to go back up the mountain and get a second set because the first ones weren't insured. And basically just God doesn't tell him to do that. God's the one who wrote the first 10 commandments, but Moses gets angry and does damage. And several times Moses will do that. He'll get very angry. Now he's normally a fairly humble person, but now and then he cracks. And of course, the last time that we have record of that is found in Numbers chapter 20, where Moses now is leading the people. It looks like they're going to actually make it into the promised land. After 40 years of wandering in a wilderness, finally Moses gets his chance to get to the promised land. But the people complain, they don't have water. Once again, I think something snaps for Moses. And he, instead of speaking to the rock and water coming out the way God told him to, Moses strikes the rock twice, and he touches the glory of God. He says, must we bring water for you out of this rock? And at that point, God says, Moses, you're not going in. You're 120 years old. You've waited over a century for this moment, but that little angry outburst just cost you your life stream. And so it's sad because there's only really a handful of times where Moses gets angry, but each time it's quite costly to him. And sometimes your vulnerability doesn't mean that you suffer from it every day. It just means that when it does show up, it has a way of doing great damage to you and your leadership career. And I would say there are those leaders that have just had those vulnerable spots. For some, it's been sexual sin, and pastors, leaders have been doing all kinds of great things for years, but there's always this weak spot in their life. If encountering the right temptation, the right circumstance, all of their marriage, their family, their career, their reputation, all of it could go down the drain in a moment of weakness. And so it's almost like just a weak spot that under the right pressure it can break, and that's what happens with Moses. He has this kind of shadow of an anger problem that you're never quite sure. And it might have been years since the last time he had a total anger breakdown, but boy, when he does, it's costly. And then the other aspect is just delegation, which is quite a famous story with him. He's working from night till day, judging and doing all the work for an entire nation of people. And of course, his father-in-law Jesse comes and says, "Why are you?" Or Jethro says, "Why are you doing all this? Why are you not appointing other able-bodied people to at least do the lower level stuff. Like you maybe do the most important, most difficult cases, but there's other people who could do a lot of what you're doing. And Moses, as you said, he has some great people around him, but often he doesn't make use of them.
Yeah.
Of course, it doesn't matter how many great lieutenants you have if you don't give them anything to do.
Right.
And so that seems to be something that he manages to deal with and address, perhaps better than his anger issue. But and God did put some people like Aaron around him, and then Joshua as well, a successor as well that he does pour into and ultimately takes his place. But Moses, like all leaders, has those areas of vulnerability that if left unchecked, unguarded, on a typical day when things aren't going too badly, that probably doesn't make any difference. If you have an anger issue, but it's just a normal day, then that's fine. But under stress and strain, if you've never really confronted that area of your life, then it can do serious damage. And as leaders, I think if we're going to be in it for the long haul, then we've got to address those issues in our life as well, because we just never know when it could trip us up.
Certainly. Well, before we look at some takeaways from Moses' life, we'll take a quick break and then we'll be right back.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes. If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
Well, Richard, I suspect that we could spend many more hours on the life of Moses. And in fact, like I mentioned at the top, that you have written some even on the life of Moses. And we'll leave links to that in the show notes, Living Out of the Overflow. Mm-hmm. And just some great insights from his life. But unfortunately, we don't have hours. Just a few more minutes here before we wrap up. What are maybe a handful or 2 or 3 takeaways from Moses' life and leadership, or what are some things that really stand out to you about his leadership that we can give the listeners today?
Well, sometimes we can get bogged down in some of their human issues and their weaknesses, but great leaders have a way of rising to the occasion at great moments. And there's one great story in Exodus 32, verse 32, where God's ready to just judge the Israelites. They've been so disobedient and complaining and rebellious. God's ready to just abandon them to the wilderness. And Moses prays for his people, and he says, basically, if you have to, blot me out of your book that you've written, but spare the people. And I'll tell you what, that's just a beautiful picture of a leader who loves his people that God's given him. And literally is what he's saying is, if it will save the people I lead, you consign me to hell, blot me out of the book of life, take away my ticket into heaven, and give it to them. I tell you what, when a leader lays his life down like that for his people, it's hard to keep praying for your people that you lead and still be frustrated with them and upset with them all the time. And as badly as these people behave at times, Moses prays for them some of the greatest, most noble prayers anywhere in the Bible. And to me, it's a beautiful picture of leadership. Moses also, in chapter 34 of Exodus, has that great request of God. He says, please show me your glory. And that ought to be what drives us as leaders, is not necessarily just growing our company, our church, our business, but saying, God, in this time I have in this life, I want to come to know you. I want to see you as you are. And interestingly, verse 35 and following of Exodus 34, it says when Moses came down from the mountain after meeting with God, his face would shine. That's the only person really that the Bible describes that way. And it's interesting. The Bible will just talk about various people in ways that no one else ever had that particular experience, and which says our walk with God is always unique to us. There'll be some similarities, some things where God will act in a similar way, but I've always just thought what a beautiful picture that was. It says that when Moses would come out from meeting with God, people could all tell that Moses had been with God because his face would shine, and he'd actually have to put a veil over his face because it was frightening to see this human flesh aglow from the presence of God. And I've often thought to myself, before we encounter people, before we go to the office, we need to be meeting with God as well. And it ought to show. People ought to be able to tell, did Sam have his quiet time today with God? You can always tell. His face might not glow, but there is the presence of Christ about him. There's the peace of God that surrounds his heart when he's met with God first before he comes to work. There's the wisdom of God at his disposal, the self-control that comes from having first heard from God before he comes into work and starts hearing the problems of the day. And I love that picture for a leader of meeting with God and then everybody just kind of whispering, oh, the boss has obviously spent time with God this morning. Because you can just tell his face might not glow, but there's always evidence when you've been with God. And the last thing maybe just to say about Moses, it's interesting that in Deuteronomy, when you get to the very end of that book, it says, chapter 34, verse 10, "But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt before Pharaoh, before all his servants and all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel." That's a pretty awesome way to wrap up someone's life. There's never been anybody who walked with God that way, who so exalted God that people were in terror of this almighty God that Moses served. But of course, when you read Numbers 20, and I write about this in the book Living Out of the Overflow, Moses is right at the very doorstep of the promised land. He can see it in the distance, and then he trips and falls. He succumbs to anger. He touches the glory of God, and God says, for that, you're not going in. Moses, you were going to go in. You were just days away from entering the promised land that you've dreamed about all of your life.
Yeah.
But he tripped as he could see the finish line. And I say he didn't finish well. Moses had his ups and downs, but I'll tell you something. As a leader, when you've been at it for a while, you realize it's not just how you start that matters, but really what matters is how you finish. And my prayer for myself and for my listeners here today is that when you get to the end of your race, when you get to the end of your life, you're not limping in ashamedly for the way you conducted yourself. You don't sort of sheepishly get to the finish line realizing, boy, I've got a lot of apologies to make. Yeah. But you're sprinting into the finish line. You're still going all out right to the end. You haven't slowed down at all. You haven't gotten distracted. And Moses kind of limps in. In fact, while everybody else is headed to the promised land, Moses ends up going up onto Mount Moriah or to Nebo and not going with the people. Joshua has to take over at that point. And so my challenge is, even as great of a man of God as he was, perhaps the greatest in the Old Testament, but he stumbled near the finish. And to me, that's one of those stark lessons, I think, that we take away from his life is finish well. Finish well with whatever it is that God assigns to you.
Well, I think that's a great place to finish this podcast. And I love those takeaways. Pray for your people as a leader. Meet with God first as a leader and finish well. Yeah. And thanks for walking us through this new series, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.